Tonight, without further ado, we have James Salzman with us from Duke University, where he has appointments in the Nicholas School of the Environment and is the Samuel Mordecai Professor in the Duke University School of Law, a wonderful interdisciplinary blend of environmental law, and looking at resources. He heralds from degrees at Yale and Harvard. How can you do better than that? It makes me, feel a little bit inferior in that sense. Came to the Duke faculty in 2004. I remember cutting a deal with him over breakfast somewhere in D.C. When the final details were worked out, and has been a wonderful addition to the faculty there in both law and environment. His specialty is international law, looking at resource use, and most recently looking at ecosystem services as it affects each and every one of us and the value of natural ecosystems to human well-being. And he's going to talk to us tonight about a project that's totally happened since I left North Carolina and Duke myself. His work on drinking water. It has produced a book which, like many of our cooperative book signing and book evenings, will be available for signing courtesy of Merritt Bookstore after the lecture for those of you that might want a copy. And without further ado, Jim Salzman.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for coming out for Friday evening. So this is the book, and as Bill said, it's for sale. I don't know if you can read it. It's got a quote that I think it's what Jared Diamond would have said if he'd read the book. No, he read the book. So what I thought I'd do is talk for 30, 40 minutes or so, tell you a bit about some of the things I found in the book, and then have a conversation for a few minutes as well. Because drinking water, as we'll see, is something that everyone cares about, everyone has a view about. So I want to start off by telling a story about a place in Bolivia called Cochabamba. Like many developing countries, like many cities in developing countries, Cochabamba faces real issues with water supply. The population is close to 1 million, but almost half of the population not only has no access to piped water, but actually has to buy their water from water vendors. And this is not at all unusual in developing countries. In fact, it's been very common throughout most of human history. The tragedy here, or one of the tragedies here, is that because they're not getting their water from the mains, they actually pay more for their water. The very poorest pay more for their water than those who can afford to get it from water mains. In the 1980s, and particularly the 1990s, there was a program called structural adjustment that was pushed by many of the international financial institutions. And the idea basically was we should privatize more public services. And we had similar debates here in the U.S. Maggie Thatcher pushed it in Britain. Ronald Reagan pushed it in the United States. And in Bolivia, basically in order to get access to international financing, the country agreed to a concession for water and waste. And in particular, where you saw this playing out in Cochabamba, was an agreement, a contract to provide, to basically manage the water, municipal water for Cochabamba. And there was a consortium that was put together. It was led by Bechtel. And the consortium was called Aguas del Tunari. And they basically came in, and the agreement was they were going to improve the infrastructure, they were going to increase the availability of water. While they were doing this, interestingly, the National Parliament passed a law requiring the licensing for water withdrawal, which turned out to be a big issue I'll talk about at the end of the presentation tonight. There's a lot of dispute over what exactly happened after Aguas del Tunari took over. Water prices did go up. Some say as high as 20%. What there's no doubt about, though, was the public reaction, which was bad. There were literally protests in the street. If you can read it, it says Aguas del Tunari, go home. It's written by a native Spanish speaker because there are exclamation points on both sides of go home. In case there was any doubt about how strongly we feel, we really want you to go home. And there actually were riots as well. A number of people were injured. And after 4 months, the city of Cochabamba broke the contract, basically told Aguas del Tunari to go home. While this was playing out, there was a collection of grassroots organizations that came together, and they published something they called the Cochabamba Declaration. And part of this, what I want to focus on for the remarks tonight, was this part of the declaration. And you can read it yourself. And essentially what they're saying is not only is access to water a human right, but it's not a marketed good. They say it should not be commodified, privatized, or traded for a commercial purpose. And this could not be more different than a declaration that had been adopted 6 years earlier at an international governmental meeting in Dublin with the Dublin Declaration. And most of the governments of the world, they came together, and their consensus declaration was the exact opposite. They said water not only has an economic value, but it must be recognized as an economic good. And so what you've got is a real chasm, a real conflict of worldviews about what we should think about water, how we should think about water. Cochabamba, for those of you who follow the anti-globalization debates, you can call it the globalization debates, it depends which side you're on. You will have heard about Cochabamba. It really has become the poster child for a lot of the anti-globalization groups. And I got interested in this because I was wondering how is it that drinking water has sort of become the equivalent of storming the Bastille for the 20th and 21st century? How is it drinking water came to play that role? And so this was part of the book that I set out to write. So the book is going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about that tonight. But the book I wrote also talks about other issues as well. So I can tell you, certainly, when I was growing up and looking at the audience, a number of you are from the same generation as I am. If we'd gone to a gas station, I grew up basically in the 70s, were my high school years. If I'd gone to a gas station and I had said I'd like some drinking water, they would have pointed me outside to the hose used to fill the car radiators. Right, the notion that you would buy bottled water at a gas station would have been laughable. And yet, the University of Central Florida, they built a brand new football stadium, $45 million football stadium in 1997. Guess how many drinking fountains were built in the stadium? 0, that's right. This is in Orlando, Florida, right? And the reason for that is that there's been a shift in our consciousness about thinking about drinking water as a commodity. There was a poll done at UC Santa Barbara. Over half the students at UC Santa Barbara say they never drink tap water. So there's a story there. Some say, and I said it in the book, that the drinking fountains seem to be going the way of the payphone. It's hard to find them in many places, and it's impossible to find them near a food court for obvious reasons. So part of the book talks about bottled water. I'm not going to talk about it tonight because it's its own story, but if you have questions about it, I'm happy to chat about it during the Q&A afterwards. One question I will ask you that you have to remind me of at the end is who can tell me what the oldest example is of the sale of bottled water? But I will leave that out there as a teaser. I'm going to try to focus during the rest of the talk while you're thinking about that. The point that I want to make about drinking water, this is sort of the take-home message, is that drinking water is a remarkably, in some respects, simple substance, right? It's H2O, it's clear. But it's a very complex resource to manage because it's a natural resource, but it has very different natures. And you really have to be successful managing drinking water as a society, you have to manage each of these quite carefully. And again, we'll talk about this as I go through the remarks. And so, as Bill said, I started this project, I started thinking about it in 2004, 2005, and I'd written a fair number of books, but the problem with all the books that I'd written that had done fine was that the audience was basically students who were required to buy them. And that's a good market, but I wanted to put myself out there and write a book that people were not required to buy. It's not a great business model, but I wanted to try it. And the idea for the book, I called it my airport book. And the idea was when you are delayed for a flight and you go into an airport bookstore, whose book are you going to pick up? Mine, right? So the measure of success for my book was not how high it was on Amazon, as high as 12,000 at one point, which is more impressive actually than it sounds, but was whether it's sold in airport bookstores. And it is sold in the Raleigh-Durham Airport bookstore. So I've achieved success. And this basically was the competition I was after. The book itself basically is 8 chapters, modeled 8 cups of water. We can talk about where that comes from as well. And the idea behind it really was inspired by the books by Mark Kurlansky. Some of you may be familiar with these, Cod, Salt. It turns out there's an entire genre of books that basically take the same approach. And the approach is to look at the history of the world through the prism of a specific commodity. So Cod really is about the history of the settling of North America and the crash of the fishing stocks. Salt is about early commerce and storing foods and such. And so the book chapters basically run the gamut. They talk about myth, who gets to drink is what I'm going to focus on tonight. Safety, how do we know what safety is? Does terrorism pose a threat to our drinking water sources? What about bottled water? Developing country issues? And then where do we go from here? Technology and economics and management. So what I want to focus on with you is really the second chapter, who gets to drink, and a little bit about need versus greed, the seventh chapter today. But again, I'm happy to talk about any of these. So one of the things that it's actually really obvious, if you think about it for a moment, is that any successful settled society has to master the issue of drinking water access. Right? There's no way you're going to have a sustainable settled society that doesn't have access to a relatively safe source of water. And in fact, if you look at any settled society from the perspective of an archaeologist, you're going to find technology, hydraulic technology, that's either storing the water or moving the water, or later in time, treating the water. And so on the left here, this is from Machu Picchu, very sophisticated series of terraces. On the right, anyone know that? That's Masada, right? So one of the driest places on Earth. They had enough water there to support a community. This is the cisterns below Istanbul, Constantinople. And there are a lot of other examples. This is the oldest one. This is called, I forget the name of it actually, I think it's Qumran, but you find this in Jordan. And these are thousands of years old. And they're associated, again, with settled societies. But the question that arises, and this really was a question that I was spurred to think about because of Coach Abamba, was who gets access to the water? Right? Because drinking water in many places is a scarce resource. Certainly safe drinking water is a scarce resource. And when there's a scarce resource, you have to allocate, you have to prioritize. And that's where you get, Bill was talking about, I do work with natural resources. That's what natural resources law is all about. Who gets it, who doesn't get it, and how do you decide that? And so I went back as far as I could. So I started with this basically a band of wandering Jews in the Middle East. And I looked at the law, basically traditional Jewish water law. And what I found was that water is not thought of as a commodity in the Torah, in the Bible. One reason for that is that it's a gift from God, and so sale would be sacrilegious. But there's a twist to that, and the twist is that if you get access to the water through human labor, wells in particular, then you actually can at least exclude. But here's the interesting part. The interesting part is even though wells can be exclusive, so basically it's your tribe's well or your family's well, it's subject to what's called the right of thirst. And the idea behind the right of thirst is that if someone has desperate need of water, basically dying of thirst, they get priority over everything else. And so the idea is you get priority over irrigation, grazing. Even if you're outside the community, you get access. And if you think about it, this rule actually makes a lot of sense because you never know when you're going to be the one who's in need of water, no matter where you are. So this is the basic idea behind traditional sort of Judean, you might say, water law. But it's followed as well in Islamic water law. So some of you may know Sharia is the name for Islamic law. It means the way to water, which basically is not surprising as well, right? In an arid environment, the culture is going to value water and the rules about water. And this is a quote from the Quran, where basically Allah is saying sharing water is actually a holy thing to do. It's a spiritual act. Any of you who are movie fans, can you tell me what that is up there? What that's from? Lawrence of Arabia, that's right, where Lawrence's guide gets blown away by Omar Sharif because he's basically using another person's well. It makes for a great drama, but it's actually not following the right of thirst, which would have been the rule in that place, but obviously no one pointed that out at the time. So I looked at a lot of other cultures as well, and you find some interesting variations. So this is a Bihar community in India, and what's interesting here is that obviously you've got concern about physical pollution, but in the Hindu tradition, as you know, there are castes. And in that tradition, there is not only physical pollution, but there's metaphysical pollution. And the idea is that there are separate sources of water for separate castes. And you don't want to mix because you actually can have spiritual pollution of the waters as well. But even in India, you have a right of thirst. And in fact, they talk about the spiritual act of sharing water. It's called I can't pronounce it correctly, I guess, the Sapta Santatas. But actually, there's a gentleman here who actually studied in India, so afterwards I can find out the correct way to pronounce it. One of the things I found interesting as I was looking into this is you might say, oh, metaphysical pollution, what a crazy idea. We had this notion in America as well. And if you think about the segregation of drinking water fountains, I don't think it's that terribly different. It's a notion somehow there's sort of an impurity, there's a spiritual aspect to who you share water with. This was taken in front of a courthouse in North Carolina in the 1940s. So I looked at a lot of different cultures, and you find pretty much the same thing all around the world in these indigenous societies, and that is the global right of thirst, whether it's in Zimbabwe or South Africa or in Australia. And so the key things that come out of looking at this are threefold. The first is, in indigenous cultures, drinking water is not a commodity. Right? Markets do not mediate access to drinking water in indigenous cultures. The idea is, the thing also, that there is a right of thirst that you find in every indigenous culture, at least every culture that I looked at. So I can't say it's a universal, but I certainly didn't find any exceptions. And perhaps the most important thing is this is a very stable system. Right? These systems of allocation have endured for a very, very long time. So the question becomes, so where do we get this idea of water as a commodity from? Right? Because it didn't come from indigenous cultures. And the place you look to start to answer that is the place you look really for all questions of water, which is Rome. Right? Rome is the great hydraulic civilization. I mean, it's quite stunning to think that basically their waterworks are still standing 2,000, 2,500 years later. And for those of you who have visited Italy, you know that it is a country, and Rome is a city that is defined by its fountains, by its management and access to water. The aqueducts, as you all know, brought the water in. The aqueducts did not bring water in initially for drinking. Rome actually has a fairly high water table. The water was brought in to supply the baths. The baths were the social center for ancient Rome, and they need a lot of water. They eventually, though, did start bringing drinking water, into the aqueducts. And they were gravity-fed, and the thing I want you to focus on is these public basins. They were called the locus. And they were the equivalent of the local well for Rome. This is a picture, an etching of it, so this is basically what it looked like. And this is a picture of Pompeii. And let's see if I can get this laser to work. Wow, look at that. Okay, so there's one right there. There's one right there. They're about every 200 yards. And these were basically where the locals got their water. But some people wanted water piped into the house. Right? Even then, we had sort of different socioeconomic groups. And here's where the story gets interesting. So this slide's a bit out of order. This basically shows you even today. This is in Venice. Fountains in Italy and free water are a given. Let me go back to the locus, though. So 40% of the water from the Marcia, which was the main aqueduct that brought in drinking water, 40% of that was piped into homes. And there was a tax that you had to pay to get water piped into your home, and the tax was called a vectigal. Now, because it was the water was gravity fed, there was no on-off spigot. The tax was based on the diameter of your pipe. Bigger diameter, more water coming in, more tax you pay. And the clever part of this is what they do with the funds. But we know this was popular. We know that getting water into your home was popular because there was a problem of lawlessness. So there was a Roman engineer called Frontinus who wrote about this, and I read some of his stuff in researching the book, and he complained about this problem that he called puncturing. So puncturing is quite literally when in the dead of night you go out and you puncture the lead pipes and you put the water into your home. And we know it's a big problem because Frontinus is complaining about it, but also there was a fine of 100,000 sesterces if you were caught puncturing. I'm still yet to find from Google exactly how much a sestercum was worth, but 100,000 of anything, except maybe a lira, is worth a lot of money. So here's a question for you, because this is a modern day example of puncturing. Anyone have any idea what this picture is? Yeah, this is from Lagos, Nigeria, and it basically is locals siphoning off electricity illegally. From obviously a lot more dangerous than puncturing. Don't do this at home. Than taking water. But puncturing is basically a universal concern. So what did they do with the money that they raised from the vectigal? What they did is they had a system of cross-subsidization. And so the money that was paid by folks who were piping the water into their homes, that was used to subsidize the free provision of water in the locus. right? So it's basically a cross-subsidized system. It's important to recognize then that this gave water a fairly complex nature, depending on who you were. So if you were a private consumer and it was being piped into your house, water was a priced good. You weren't really paying for the water itself. You were paying for the service of delivering the water. But you basically had to pay for a cup of wine, you had to pay for a cup of water. To most Romans, though, there was a right of thirst. Right? You get your water for free at the locus. And it also provided a political statement. So Augustus was the first Roman emperor. Right? Prior to Augustus, Rome had been a republic. One of the very first things Augustus does after he takes power and starts to really exercise, basically his dominion, is that he upgraded many of the locus and made them really imperial with statues and such. And classicists who write about this say that the basic idea was political. He was basically trying to send the message that you are getting your water aquae nomine Caesaris, water in the name of Caesar, your leader. So you should be grateful that you've got a leader like me who's going to be giving you this water. It's imperial beneficence, essentially, and serves as a justification for the regime change. So the question then is, we've got water that's sort of cross-subsidized, so there's a beginning of commercial aspect, but what about the real sale of water? And for that, we move forward about 1,500 years to New York City. So I actually love this. First of all, it's just to make a point about the fort that the Dutch built. Before I get to that, though, so this is one of those sort of optimistic publications. So it's the history of civic services in the city of New York, water supply number 1, right? It's like, what's number 2, right? Sanitation is number 2. So I don't think there ever was a number 2. But the point here is twofold. The first is the Dutch did in fact build a fort. The second is that the source of their drinking water was outside the fort. So we all know the story of how the island of Manhattan is purchased from the Indians. And most of the water that was collected by the Dutch, by the early settlers, was rainwater collection, but there was a pond, which is about Broadway and 30th around now, called the Dutch called the Kalchook. It later became anglicized to the Collect. There were plans to build wells, but Peter Stuyvesant didn't want to spend the money for it, so he said no. That turned out to be short-sighted because the English they sail up the Hudson, the Dutch go into their fort, and they close the gate and realize there's no water, right? The wells are outside. And so that's one of the reasons that they surrender almost immediately. And they didn't really, Peter Stuyvesant, in writing a letter to his overlords explaining why he had given up the settlement, said, don't worry about it. There aren't secure sources of drinking water. We can go back whenever we want and take it back. So not surprisingly, one of the very first things the British do is to build, basically create public wells to try to get around that issue. But the wells really are not being paid, except for the very first ones. They're not being spent. Public funds aren't being used to dig the wells. Basically, local groups get together if they want to build a well. Basically, what's happening is reliance still on the Collect and the water from the Collect, and that proves problematic as you move into the 18th century because New York is becoming urbanized. Much denser population. There are tanneries around the Collect. There are slaughterhouses, and there's a guy called Peter Kalm. He visited in 1746. He was a Swedish botanist, so bringing sort of ecological connection. Not only did he write in his memoir that the Collect was a very sink and common sewer, but in a line that Rodney Dangerfield would have appreciated, he said, the water is so bad that horses from out of town refuse to drink it. So it was a problem. So what happens in New York? Well, two things happen. The first is you get a rise of private trade. And so there's what's called the tea water market. The tea water trade starts. And these are people who went around the city with water that was collected from particular springs. The Haddonbrook Spring was the best known. In these barrels, and they basically would go around and sell drinking water. It was for tea, but it was drinking water, basically. So that's one thing that happens. But there are problems with fighting fires as well, and there's a concern about that, and access to water more generally. And so in the late, basically 1760s, 1770s, the city fathers, and I'm sorry, just to make a quick point, the idea of someone selling water, as I said, we saw it in Cochabamba. This is an old tradition. So this is a Velázquez painting from 1620 of a water cellar. So water cellars are a very old and honored tradition, and the tea market trade was basically the same thing. So anyway, so the governors of New York City, basically get together and say we have to do something to provide drinking water beyond simply what's happening with the tea water. And so what they do is they approve what's going to be this fantastic system of aqueducts throughout the city. The water is pumped by steam engines. And to fund this, they issue the very first money from an American city. And this actually is a note. It's basically an IOU from the city of New York. The idea is brilliant. The timing is terrible because the British occupy New York and destroy everything. And so the Revolutionary War ends, and basically there are no plans that are approved, and things keep getting worse. And New York keeps growing as well. And so you then get what is, I think, the strangest story in the history of New York's, maybe in the history of New York, but certainly the history of New York's water supply. So you get this very unlikely initiative between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Right? This is the same Aaron Burr that shot and killed Alexander Hamilton 8 years later. And what they do is they get together, and it's not just them, but they're two of the founding members, and they create something called the Manhattan Company. And Burr goes up to Albany, to the legislature, and says, give us a charter for the Manhattan Company to allow us to raise money, and we will use it to provide clean and wholesome drinking water. And the assumption is that they're going to get water from the Bronx River, which is still clean at this time. But Burr is and was and would become and remain a scoundrel. And so he doesn't care at all about drinking water. So they get the authority to raise $2 million, which is real money back then. Only 10% of that is spent to actually get water from the collect. The other 90% is used to lend, because what they want is a charter so they can basically raise money and lend it without the restrictions of a bank. So what happens? What happens is the Manhattan Company eventually becomes the Chase Manhattan Bank. True story. Now J.P. Morgan, Chase Manhattan. And in fact, if you look at the logo for Chase Manhattan, it's the cross-section of a wooden water pipe. And up until the early 1900s, they kept providing water because they were afraid they would lose their charter. True story. I mean, actually everything I'm telling you is true. It's unlike the courses I teach it too. And so what they do is they drive the tea water pumps out of business. And they're still getting water from the collect, which is even more hideous than before. And the wealthy are now importing soda water. It's a terrible problem. Over the same period, Philadelphia, Boston, the other rival cities are all basically putting in piped water. And these fires are breaking out, cholera, typhoid, terrible problems. So eventually, and I think most of you actually know this story, eventually the city government gets together and says, we need a reliable source of water that is distant from the city, that is significant, and that's where Croton, the water from Croton, comes from. So 1832, actually it's mid-1830s it comes in. This is actually the part of the Croton Aqueduct. And there are huge celebrations in the city when this actually happens. 3 days of celebration to commemorate this new source of drinking water. And of course, early 1900s, they decide they're going to expand it, and that's when you start going up to the Catskills and Delaware watershed to bring even more water down to New York City. And so when you look at the story of New York, there are a few things that become evident. New York, in some respects, is the great model for the private provision of water, for commodification of water. Because really, until the very end, when just the failure has been utter and can't be denied, New York City tries to provide its water through private provision. And it doesn't work. So they finally bring in the water from a public source. But even then, you've got this strange right of water. So I call it aquae nomine Caesaris, but what happens is for the first 20 years after the water is brought in from Croton, you have what are called the Croton Street hydrants. And basically, anyone could get free water that wanted to. They just went to the hydrants and filled their water, and then went to where they were living. Eventually, the Croton Street hydrants, or the hydrants, become focused mainly for fire protection, because most people at this point, 20, 30 years after this, 1850s, 1860s, are getting water into where they live, but it's not primarily for drinking water. Anyone know what the primary demand is for water? It's for water closets, right? Sanitation. It basically is the idea of toilets, which is a great idea as well. So, I could have told you similar stories in many other places. Philadelphia, London's an interesting story in itself. Boston. There's a related story that I want to bring in now that I devote 2 chapters of the book to. I just want to touch on it briefly because it's a very important related aspect. And that is that even if you get the water into the city, you have to have some assurance that water is safe to drink. And if you think about it, the idea of safe drinking water actually is not obvious. Right? I mean, how is it that we know our water is safe to drink, or more accurately, why is it we trust that the water that we drink is safe? And it turns out that people's conceptions of safe drinking water depends fundamentally on what you think causes disease. Right? And that's changed, obviously, over time. And so ancient Greece and Rome, you would say you have the four humors. Really up until the mid-1800s, the dominant theory was called the miasmatic theory, the idea that these poisonous vapors that you breathed cause disease. It's not until people realize that this is invisible stuff in water, the germ theory, that our whole notion of what safe drinking water means. And that doesn't really come into play popularly until the 1860s, 1870s. And so the actions that we take to ensure drinking water is safe, and that we even think about safe drinking water, changes dramatically over time. And to explain that, I want to tell a story of a guy called John Snow and the Broad Street Pump. So Snow was a very interesting character. He was a self-made man. He was a very sort of innovative, clever doctor. He actually delivered anesthesia to Queen Victoria. She was the first royal to have anesthesia when she was delivering a kid. And, it's the 1830s. I mean, a lot could go wrong when you're doing that, but fortunately she survived, and her child survived. Snow was really, really interested with cholera. And he was convinced that unsafe water was the cause of cholera, which was not the dominant theory. The dominant theory was miasma. There were these sort of cholers in the air, but he didn't know how to prove it. And so there was an outbreak of cholera in a part of London called Soho. And Snow took advantage of the fact that there had been a change in the law about 10 years earlier that had required the public authorities to take down the details of people when they died. How old were they? What were their names? Where had they lived? I mean, prior to that, frankly, it was very similar to Monty Python's Bring Out Your Dead, right? I mean, basically, you died and you were buried, and that was pretty much it. Snow goes to the Public Records Office after this outbreak, and he puts together a map. And if you can see, actually, right in the middle is this thing called Pump. So that was the Broad Street Pump. And what Snow realized, this is the very first type of map ever produced that does this. It's really the origins of epidemiology. What he realized is that the deaths are all concentrated around the Broad Street Pump. But there's a problem. And the problem is that there are two deaths at the same time from cholera, one 8 miles away, one 11 miles away. How could that possibly be due to the water? But he's a very dogged researcher. So he goes to visit the house of the woman from 8 miles away who died, and he starts talking to her son, sharing his condolences. And it turns out, as the son relates, that his mother used to live in Soho and so loved the water from the Broad Street Pump that she would ask her maid once a week to collect water and bring it to her. So Snow starts getting interested. And it turns out that his aunt also sadly died because she's the one who lived 11 miles away. She'd come to visit a few days earlier. And so Snow basically goes to the local government, the authorities, tells them what's going on, and they shut down the pump. And it's the very first time in history that disease is traced to a waterborne incident, and public authorities react as a result. And until fairly recently, they just changed it. The International Society of Epidemiology, their symbol was a pump handle. So this is really where epidemiology comes from. Another key figure at this period is a guy called Edwin Chadwick. He believed in a sort of traditional miasmatic theory. When he says all smell is disease, he's not kidding, right? That's basically saying this is how disease, it's not the kind of thing you kid about anyway, but he's basically saying this is basically where disease is coming from. He was the author of the Poor Laws, and he was very, very influential in basically improving the quality of sanitation, the technology of sanitation in London. But the thing that's important to realize when you read this quote from him is this is the age where basically cleanliness is next to godliness. And the idea basically is the physical pollution also is linked to spiritual pollution. And whether you're going to improve the morals of these poor people is to improve the quality of their life in terms of health and sanitation. And so the two are allies for a while. They tend to, they part in the debate over where the sewers of London should discharge. right? So Chadwick basically says, well, they should just discharge into the Thames. It's the closest place. Snow says, no, that's where people get their water. He says, oh, don't worry about that. All smell is disease. I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's basically where they had conflict. This is the last point I want to make about this before I move on. And I think this is pretty interesting. If you had talked to people in Madras, India, which was the crown of India, in London in 1850, you would have used the same descriptions for both cities. Right? A cesspool city was what a journalist wrote to describe London. London in the 1850s, the Parliament had to adjourn because the stench was so overpowering from the Thames. It was just this awful, awful, literally cesspool. I mean, it was an open sewer. That all changes in London by the 1870s, 1880s because of the work primarily of Chadwick. It doesn't happen in the developing world, in the colonies. And the phrase, you're all familiar with the phrase cordon sanitaire? What that meant originally was the area around that marked off the Western Enclave. The Western Enclave, you had sanitation and clean drinking water. Outside the cordon sanitaire, you didn't. And there really was a fork in the road about 150 years ago. If the colonial powers had basically done for their colonial cities what they were doing in the sort of home country cities, then many of the issues that you see in the developing world wouldn't be as big a problem today. But that wasn't where the investment was made. Last thing I'll just talk about with this is the question, is it safe to drink the water? There are all different types of issues that come up when you're talking about safe drinking water. This was, so if you had been really in any American city at the turn of the 1900s, what you would have done for water in a public place was to turn on the tap and drink from a mug that was chained so no one would steal it. With the rise of the germ theory, the public health authorities realized this is a bad idea, and so they start this public relations campaign. Right, and this is from the Minnesota State Board of Health, right, saying not a good idea, right, unless you want to die, to drink from a common mug. This also is where you get the Dixie cup. So this is actually another example. You know, have a drink, my child. So where do you get the Dixie cup from? The Dixie cup is invented because you need disposable, cheap cups that you can fill from a public source. So that's where you get that. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about before I end and leave some questions. Bill, is the timing okay? Okay, so really the most overwhelming problem I think that you face in the area of drinking water is not drinking water in the developed world, but drinking water in the developing world. And if the statistics, obviously these are fairly rough numbers, but they're daunting. And if you talk to development experts in the developing world, UN, World Bank, what they will tell you is that the greatest single threat to human health is not AIDS, is not the direct impacts of climate change, it's unsafe drinking water. That's the single most important threat to quality of life in developing countries. And the statistics have explained for themselves why that is. And in fact, the UN has made one of its core development goals, one of the Millennium Development Goals, to address this specifically. And this is a goal actually that's almost been met. So there's been a lot of success in this area. But the way to think about this, I think, is really to take our assumptions and turn them completely on their heads. Right? So we don't think about the quality of drinking water. We turn on the tap. We don't think about the amount of drinking water. We pay basically nothing for the amount of water that we drink. And it's not our problem. Right? We have governments, we have corporations that take care of providing us drinking water. None of that is true in the developing world. Right? It's a personal responsibility. The quality of the water cannot be assumed, and the quantity generally is how much you can carry. So it's a totally different type of situation. And there's a gender aspect as well. Because a lot of people in a lot of areas have to actually get their drinking water, this ends up falling on women and girls. And so as a result of this, there have been a lot of studies that have been done. This study was done in East Africa. That girls basically spend about 90 minutes a day. It's much more in other parts of the developing country. Enormous impacts on productivity. Right? If you're gathering water instead of going to school or working in the fields or starting a business, there are huge implications. And so when you talk to development experts, one of the reasons they say it's such a problem is not simply the health impact, but if you can get clean water into a poor community, then it totally changes the gender dynamics as well in terms of productivity for what girls and women now have the extra time to do. And on top of that, it's expensive. Right? So this slide basically points out it can be 10 times, 20 times more expensive because there are no economies of scale. And so you've got this whole class of water vendors, water merchants, that go all the way back to Velasquez, and before that as well. I'm going to move on, basically. What it's suggesting is that sanitation obviously is a huge part of this as well. It's not simply access to drinking water. So what's to be done about this? Well, this brings us back to the story we started with Cochabamba. And one of the reactions to the threats that were posed by access to drinking water was this notion of structural adjustment, privatization. And the idea was that state provision of water essentially has failed in the developing world, so you need to bring in the rigors of the market and companies who will be motivated by profit, who are going to satisfy their consumers' demand. They have access to private capital, which is badly needed, and that's really the thinking behind the Dublin Declaration. Right. In fact, it goes farther and says not only is drinking water, should we think of drinking water as a commodity, but it's a mistake to think of it as a basic right because we overconsume, we overuse what is free. So you have to charge a price for it in order to basically to discipline the use. And not surprisingly, there's been a huge rise globally in the water service industry. Privatization or semi-privatization in many countries around the world with mixed results. This has been met, in turn, by proponents who say, no, there is a global right to water. And it's been supported by the UN. The UN Economic and Social Council adopted something called General Comment 15. The UN General Assembly adopted a resolution in 2010 that said there's a human right to water. And this is the phrasing they've used for it. And it's important that these are negotiated carefully. They say the water has to be sufficient, has to be enough, has to be safe, has to be physically accessible, has to be nearby, has to be affordable. Realize they're not saying it's free. They're saying it has to be affordable. And so this debate continues about whether we should think about it as an economic commodity or as a human right. And so it really brings us to today. And there's really sort of fundamental fissures that go to the very nature of drinking water. Which is it? All right, should we think of it as a market commodity that is subject to market forces? Or should we think about it as something that it is a fundamental right of a citizen to expect their government, their authorities to provide this for them? How should it be provided? Who should provide it? And I guess what I'd leave you with is that this book is, it's called Drinking Water, A History, and it does try to bring a historical vantage to the idea of drinking water, to the provision of drinking water, the protection of drinking water. And I guess what I'd leave you with is to point out that this debate over right versus commodity is really ahistorical. Because we know, just from what I've told you, that this issue has gone way back in time. Treating drinking water access as a right is not a new idea. As a commodity is not a new idea. And as I said earlier, it's a complex resource. You have to manage it a lot of different ways. And if you think about this in terms of Rome, I think this explains a lot. Right? The Roman system endured for 800 years and would have endured longer but for the barbarians. And how is it they were able to do that? Well, they were able to manage all the different aspects of water. They were able to manage the physical aspect, the social aspect, the economic aspect, the political aspect. Where things fell apart in Cochabamba to a large extent, fell apart to a large extent in Cochabamba was actually the social aspect, was the law that basically required the licensing of water. People really got upset about that because they thought basically it was taking away something that had been theirs by right. And so that the part of what happened in Cochabamba, there's more to it than that, was basically a blindness to the different natures of water instead of focusing on simply as a price commodity. And so in my own work and in the book, I talk about this more in the book, these are, I think, some of the really more interesting questions that don't have easy answers, which is how do things change over time? I mean, there's no question that our conception of drinking water, our conception of safety changes. What is it that basically shifts it from one point to another? What are those junctures in human history, the Jon Snow moments? That basically change that. A lot more stories in the book, which is for sale in the lobby. So I will, let's see, actually this worked out perfectly. So it's quarter up. So Bill, I'll let you sort of tell me when to stop, but I'm happy to chat or answer a few questions as you'd like. Ma'am? Mm-hmm.
And the Western states where people with water rights are they still owned? Well, I'm studying it.
Yeah. Sure, sure.
Is there a difference?
Yeah, there's a huge difference, right? So when you talk about water, there are two very different advantages you can look at. You can look at water quality, which is primarily what I've been talking about, and you can look at water quantity, which is where her question is directed. And it turns out, by historical sort of path dependence, the states in the eastern part of the United States follow a type of water law called riparian water law, which basically means you get access to the water source if you are neighboring to the water source, if you're a riparian owner. In the western United States, starting really in Colorado, largely because of the mining operations, where basically you had to move water long distances in order to basically have the slurries to run minerals through and such, they developed an entirely different type of water law. It's called prior appropriation. And basically what it means is first in time, first in right. The first person to use water, however far from the river it is, for a, quote, beneficial use, their use of the water takes priority over everyone else for the amount they're making beneficial use of. Now that makes sense if you've got some mining camps. It doesn't make sense if you're modern day California, where, have you ever seen Chinatown, the movie? Okay, well Chinatown basically is based on this prior appropriation idea because the Owens Valley has these senior water rights, and LA, which really is just a giant sponge, is trying to get access to it, and that's where Jack Nicholson sort of goes out into the wild. How this all links into drinking water is that cities basically have very junior rights, generally, to agricultural districts in particular. And so there are these deals that have been going on where a number of these cities are trying to negotiate with the water rights away from these agricultural districts, and to pardon the expression, the agricultural districts have the cities over a barrel because they have the senior rights. And so one of the issues going forward is, are they going to be able to get access to that water? More fundamentally, since it's going to be difficult to get access to the water, eventually economics will play out. They say the West is the only place where water runs uphill to money, right? And so what's happening as a result of that, which I talk about in the book, which is really interesting, is the focus on efficiency, right? And the notion that you can either, if you're short of water, either you get more water, or you conserve the water you have. And in the West, because of the intricacies of the prior appropriation system, it's hard to get more water. The difficulty we have, and this is in the East, which is less of an issue because of rainfall and such, but it's a big issue in the West. We are using water that's treated clean enough to drink, basically to wash our car, right, and to fill our swimming pool. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And so it brings up the whole issue of what's called gray water, the yuck factor, and all these different ways of how we might be able to basically have two different sources of water, one for drinking domestic use and one for every other use. But then you've got big infrastructure issues as well. So it's a big issue, and talked about it in part of the book. But the prior appropriation system makes it much harder to get access to the water. Sure.
We have been blessed in New York State with abundant, clean water. What do you think are the implications for an intention hydrofracking?
I knew I was going to go fracking. But fortunately, actually, one of the benefits of being at Duke is that two of the top researchers in the world on fracking work at the Nicholas School, and Rob Jackson and Avner Vengosh. So here's what we know. Well, let me take a step back. Let me tell you what the threats are to water, and then I can tell you what we know, because there's a gap. So there are three basic threats to water from fracking. The first is quantity. Right, fracking, for those of you who don't know, basically is this technology or approach to mining where you go vertical, which is what we're used to, but then you go horizontal through shale. And basically you blast out with water and sand and other sort of special chemicals, you blast the shale apart and you're able to bring the natural gas and the hydrocarbons back up. And it turns out, no one really expected this, but there are vast resources of these these hydrocarbons and such along what's called the Marcellus Shale, which is part of New York and other parts of the Northeast. So the first concern is water quantity. You're pumping a lot of water down there. The second, water quality, there are two concerns. The first concern is this stuff that they're pumping underneath, which is a lot of nasty ingredients, is that going to make its way up into aquifers? And it's a distance of a mile or more. To date, there's no evidence that that's happening. There are concerns, but there's no evidence that the fracking fluids have made their way up through the geology to aquifers. The third concern is, what about the stuff you're bringing back up? And there is a problem, and it's twofold. The first is methane is leaking from the pipes as they come back up. So if you want to see something on YouTube that will blow your mind, go on YouTube and type exploding faucet. And what you will see is someone turning on a faucet, lighting a match, and kaboom, which is not what you want to have happen when you turn your faucet on. There's basically this methane that's coming up. Is it dangerous in terms of methane in our drinking water? No one knows. It's just something that hasn't been really studied. It's not regulated, but there's a lot of study going on with that. The second issue is, what do you do with the fracking fluids and the gunk that's leached into them that come back up? That's in a sense no different than any other mining operation. It poses a threat, but it's a threat that can be adequately regulated. Whether it is being adequately regulated is a key issue. And so, part of it is that, as I wanted to distinguish between what the concerns are and what's known, there's a lot of research still underway. Right now, the suggestion is the big things to be concerned about are water quantity, if you're in a water scarce area, and what to do with the stuff when it comes back up. The one area where there's not good evidence of real problems to date is the stuff that's going deep underground. I don't know if that answers. Sir?
So our water quality as far as agricultural pollution such as atrazine, water, and other contaminants?
Yeah, and it doesn't just have to be atrazine. There are a lot of chemicals that we place on the fields for specific purposes that we know are harmful to drink, right? And so the question becomes, how well regulated are our drinking water supplies? So there's a law called the Safe Drinking Water Act. And basically the way it's supposed to work is that the municipal water authorities, the water suppliers, generally municipal suppliers, are supposed to test for particular substances. Atrazine is one of them. And if they're in excess, then they shouldn't provide the water. They need to basically, filter it more, get to different sources, things like that. So the issue, though, to sort of expand your question, the issue with the Safe Drinking Water Act isn't so much atrazine. Obviously it's an issue, but people know about it and they're trying to regulate it. A much bigger issue, there's a lot of people concerned, and whether you should be concerned or not, I think is an interesting question. It goes back to whether we think our water is safe, is all the medications and other contaminants that go into drinking water. And so if I were to take an assay of the fat of any person in this room, I would find over 50 man-made chemicals in your fat tissues. Actually, I thought this question may come up, so I actually turned to the right page of a book that could be yours. So there was a study done by the U.S. Geological Survey of streams. They found 82 contaminants in 80% of the streams they sampled. Let's see, the study done by the Associated Press found 56 pharmaceuticals in treated drinking water. So how is this getting in the water? To a certain extent, it's people flushing drugs down the toilet. More of it, though, is just the fact that we don't completely metabolize the drugs that we take. And these are drugs that are designed to change to change body chemistry. And so the question is, if all this stuff is in our drinking water, what the heck should we do? Is this dangerous or not? And this is where you get into the really difficult part about what does it mean to be safe, right? So because even though something's in our drinking water doesn't mean that it poses a serious risk. Right, so just to give you a sense, so 1 part per trillion, which is some of the concentrations of the things we're talking about, that's the equivalent of a drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Right, it's a very, very small concentration. Would it be better if it weren't in our drinking water? Absolutely. But if it is, should we be concerned about it? Is there something to do about it? And that's where you get to the question of how should we spend our public resources? Could we filter for that? Yes, it would be extremely expensive. Historically, we don't like to pay for water treatment. Right? There are a number of parts of the United States where the water pipes were laid just after the Civil War. It's part of the whole infrastructure issue. And so this is a long way to answer your question, to say, how we think about atrazine and such really depends on how much faith you have in public institutions. Do you trust the government chemists and the agencies to identify those compounds that need to be regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act? And if they are regulated, do we trust our utilities to test for them adequately? For what it's worth, I have no problem drinking tap water. I have no problem with my kids drink tap water. I think as a society we face a much greater health risk from obesity than we do from drinking tap water. But intelligent people, reasonable people differ on that. And it's an area where really, to a certain extent, you got to trust the experts, or not trust them. But it's very hard for an individual to know where the truth lies.
Can you have your water tested from a local well or something, like the county health department or something?
I'm sorry. The question was.
Can you have your water tested?
I don't know what the rule is in New York. In North Carolina, you do the testing yourself. But I don't know what the law is in New York.
A couple of days ago, the Pacific Institute hosted a show on NPR on water.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things they mentioned was a law on the books of Maine that was called Absolute Dominion, which allowed,
No, go ahead.
which allowed companies like Pepsi to go in and just pump water without being charged by the state of Maine. Are there any other states that have that same law, absolute dominion?
Yeah, I mean,
New York,
I think that might have been a little misleading if they put it that way, because no one's charged by the state to take water, right? Water provision is a local government action. Peter Glick was probably part of this. He's a big water authority. He's he's an impressive scholar. Water provision is almost entirely local. So the bigger question really is, should Pepsi be charged the same amount that you're charged? And this gets into what's called block pricing or such. The book starts off with a story of McLeod, California, where there was a standoff not with Pepsi but with Nestle. But the fact is, these companies are withdrawing a lot of water. I mean, one of the things I find interesting, this sort of brings up a bigger issue. A lot of people have concerns over bottled water because of the environmental impacts, in terms of quantity, in terms of packaging and such. And one of the things that I've always found interesting as I've been writing this book is that soft drinks have almost the identical environmental impact. But no one talks about soft drinks and environmental impact. They talk about soft drinks and obesity. But in terms of, what are soft drinks? Soft drinks basically are the secret formula, and water, and they're in packaging as well. And I don't know if it's because it's this sort of puritanical streak in us that makes us feel guilty for buying bottled water. The environmental impacts are real, but it's curious how the debate has changed around that. But the issue that Peter and those were talking about, there are these standoffs, not just in Maine, all over the place, right, about who should have access to water. It gets back to who owns the water.
One more.
Sorry?
One more.
One more. Okay. Sir?
Could you speak a bit about iron and manganese as causing health risks?
Well, again, those are regulated. And so, as with all these things, it's a question of concentrations. Iron and manganese are naturally occurring. Arsenic in some areas is naturally occurring. And the question is, what's the WHO, World Health Organization standard? What's the U.S. Safe Drinking Water Standard? And there's a whole range. Some people are concerned about fluoride, naturally occurring fluoride in their water. I guess the two things I would say, sort of in parting, is people ask me if I filter my water. I don't. I trust the tap water, but a fair number of people do. That's fine, but those are generally charcoal filters, and those are not going to take out a lot of these compounds that people are talking about. The second thing is, don't think that drinking bottled water is going to address any of these issues. Bottled water, particularly, let me put it this way: if bottled water does not cross state lines, it's effectively unregulated. Bottled water is regulated by the U.S. Food and Drug Agency. Tap water is regulated by the U.S. EPA. They're covered under different statutes. One's a food product, one's drinking water. I was talking to Bill beforehand. Bill has the honor of having grown up in Cleveland, and Fiji water, which you all know Fiji, right? They ran a campaign, an inspired campaign a few years ago, where they said, it's called Fiji water because it's not from Cleveland, right? Which I thought was kind of harsh to Cleveland. So anyway, Cleveland, I thought was very clever. What the Cleveland Mayor's Office did is they funded a chemical assay of 30 different brands of bottled water, and what they found was over a third of them were more contaminated or had more contaminants than Cleveland tap water. And the reason is, your tap water is tested hundreds, if it's New York City, thousands of times a year. there's a huge infrastructure, checking out the tap water. It's not the same for bottled water. Is there a reason to think bottled water is unsafe? No. But it clearly is less strictly regulated than tap water. And so if you're thirsty or you don't want to drink soda or juice, you're not an immoral person to drink tap water, but don't think you're virtuous either. All right.
Anybody, thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Of course, he will be available on the market out at the table there. Many thanks to all of you for coming. And April 19th, Ray Hillmore